Hello and welcome to AAT Level 3, Analyzing Costs and Revenues. This session is on absorption costing, and the objectives are to learn the main steps of the process which allows us to calculate the full production cost. So we will learn how we can allocate, apportion, reapportion and absorb overheads into the cost unit. The reason why this is so important is because absorption costing allows businesses to calculate the full production cost of their output before the period begins and production starts taking place. So absorption costing is a method which we use to calculate the full production cost per unit by calculating an overhead cost per unit and adding it to the prime cost per unit. If we look at our production costs and think about why we incur them, the answer is this is only because we are manufacturing our units. So the reason why we have production costs is because we are producing our cost units in a business. Of course, those production costs relate to the cost unit. However, some of those production costs are direct and others are indirect production costs. And we can't just link both of these to the cost unit immediately. So we look at each one of them in turns. The first one, the direct costs, things such as the direct materials and direct labor. The reason why we call them direct is because we can link them directly to the cost unit. We can measure how much of each we need to make our output, so these ones we just allocate directly. And that is a piece of cake. The interesting bit is when we look at the overheads, which are the indirect costs. We call them indirect because we cannot easily determine how much of what we spend relates to making our output. And this is why we can't just send them to the cost unit like we did with the direct costs. So here we have to think about why we incur our overheads. And normally we discover that they relate to different cost centers that we have in the business. So our task is, first of all, to allocate those indirect costs to the different cost centers. We have to divide them between the cost centers to which they relate. And not just that, but we have to calculate what proportion of the total overhead cost should go into each cost center. That's what we call apportionment. So really, we look at our overheads and we allocate and apportion them, divide them, using a fair basis between our cost centers. And when we say fair basis, we mean here that we don't just randomly divide the total cost by the number of cost centers to calculate how much should relate to each of them. So if we have, let's say, 3 cost centers in the business, we are not going to take the rent cost and divide it by 3 and give 1/3 of each of the cost centers. Because the rent really relates to the floor space of each of the cost centers. So if one of the departments is really small, it should really take a small proportion of the cost for the rent. And if one of the departments is really large, that one should take a large proportion of the total cost. So we don't just divide it by 3 and give 1/3 to each of the cost centers. So when we have allocated and apportioned the overheads into the various cost centers, we will notice that in most businesses we have a variety. Some of the cost centers are production cost centers. For example, we may have a cutting department and a finishing department, each of them being a cost center, production cost center. And we might have also service cost centers, like the maintenance department, and they will all be part of our business. So if we have allocated and apportioned all the overhead costs between them, we have to think if we are able now to link that overhead cost straight to the cost unit. And if you just think about it carefully, you will notice that in the service cost centers, ones like the maintenance department, for example, we don't really produce our units. and the reason why we have to pay rent for the service department, for the maintenance department, the reason why we have to pay utility bills and salaries for the people working in the maintenance department is not because they make our cost unit, it's because they are here to provide service to the production departments. So we don't just link the cost from the service department to the cost unit. What we do instead is we take that cost out of the service department and we divide it between the production departments which use the services of this cost center. So again, we are not going to just take the total cost and divide it by 2 if we have 2 production cost centers. We're going to look at each of the cost centers and to what extent they use the services of the maintenance department. And the one that uses their services more is going to get a bigger proportion of the cost that comes from the service cost center, from maintenance. The one that uses their services less is going to take a smaller proportion of the cost, because this is fair. Now from here, we would have realized that now the service cost center has no cost allocated to it. All the cost has gone to the production departments, and they're the ones that produce our units. So we take the final step where we determine how much of the total production cost in each department should be charged to the cost unit. And that is what we call absorption. Here we absorb the overhead cost, linking it to the cost unit. So the big picture in absorption costing looks something like this. First of all, we start with all direct costs and allocate them directly to the cost unit. Next thing, we look at all the indirect costs and the cost centers which have incurred them. We have to divide those indirect costs in a fair way between the cost centers. That's step number 2, which we call allocate and apportion the overheads. Then we look at the service cost centers. We take the cost out of them and we divide it in between the production cost centers only. That's what we call reapportionment, step number 3. And the last step, the final one, we absorb all the production costs from the production cost centers into our cost units. So we have now been able to calculate the full production cost per unit. The full production cost per unit made up of the direct cost per unit, the one we call prime cost, and the overhead cost per unit. So let's summarize everything we learned in this session. We saw that absorption costing helps us calculate the full production cost per unit. And we learned that it goes through a few stages, beginning with allocating overheads, apportioning them, reapportioning them, and absorbing them into the cost unit. We will learn how each of these processes work in a bit more detail in the next couple of sessions.